I've been working at the thrift store for about a week before I stumbled across the box. I say working, but it's more like volunteering. I'll save you the gory details, but needless to say that I screwed up after a night of drinking and ran into a bus stop with my car. Thankfully, it was 3 a.m., so there was no one in it, and the judge decided not to ruin my life over a mistake. He gave me community service and told me it better never happen again. Community service was ideal since I was in college and I ain't got a lot of money. I also couldn't afford to get kicked out of college for going to jail neither. So with 36 weeks of community service to serve, I sat around working at my local thrift store, Charlie's Second Chances. It's a pretty easy job. I work in the back with the other court appointees. We clean and sort incoming items so that they can be placed on the shelves and priced. Most of my coworkers are also court-appointed screw-ups who do the bare minimum and get their cards punched by the boss every week. Unlike me, they usually leave the job and go to a second job to pay the bills, while I go to classes or head off to bed. It's not difficult work, but it's a pain and it cuts into my everyday life. I'd been on the line for a few hours, sorting boxes and cleaning items, when I noticed a box in the corner that I didn't think I'd ever seen before. The carton looked ready to split, and it was so dusty that it almost looked like it was held together by the gray dust that coated it. I left the box I was working on and walked over to inspect it closer. It was wedged beside a bookcase in a wall, clearly having fallen from the top of the case at some point or another. I tried to lift it out, but the carton tore and outspilled what I first thought was an ancient Dick Tracy costume. Inside was a hat, a fedora, but not sharp enough to gain the interest of today's fedora wearers, and a long coat that looked well worn and well cared for. The front was covered in mud, and some kind of water or muck discolored the hem. There was a pair of black boots as well, also covered in powdery mud. The whole mess threw up a cloud of brown dust as it spilled out, and I coughed as I stood up, waving my hands around to clear some of the dust out. When it cleared, I noticed the book at my feet. If the coat was dirty, then the book was filthy. It was a battered old journal, a leather relic that was bloated and water-ruined. It must have once been a handsome thing, but now it looked like the act of opening it might be enough to destroy it forever. I slipped it in my pocket and brought the clothes back to the line to process them. The coat would never pass inspection. It was much too dirty, so I decided to offer the boss a few bucks for it and take it home. It was a nice coat, good in the rain and snow, I figured. I took the hat, too, when I saw it in the garbage on the way to my car. There was no sense breaking up the set after all, and I really did think it would make a good detective costume if I wanted. I didn't remember the book until I traded my jeans for some comfy pajamas. I intended to stay in and study that night. The pants clattered loudly on the floor, and I realized that the bloated wreck had been in the back pocket the whole time. I didn't sit a lot at work, and it had been virtually forgotten about once I stuffed it back there. I took it out now and looked at it. The cover was moldy, the mold now a little more than green powder, and when I opened it up, the same dust as the boots puffed out. The first page proclaimed it to be the personal journal of K. Barger, private detective. The pages were worn and some of them were stuck together, but I could decipher enough to realize I had found someone's memoir. There were notes that this K. Barger had been keeping to write his own story with, once he got out of the game, as he called it. It detailed case after case where K. Barger had caught this person or that person, helping the Atlanta PD solve many difficult cases with his partner, Dom Forthwit. K had clearly been hoping to turn this story into a book after he retired, living off the tales of his exploits long after they'd ended. My psychology notes lay forgotten as I pored over the journal. On a whim, I Googled K. Barger, private detective, but came up with very little. A few old newspaper clippings and a squib about his disappearance, and an ad for Barger and Witt Detective Agency that still operated in Old Town. K. Barger became Killian Barger, and it looked like this was his old journal. I also found a squib in the paper about his old partner paying for information about Killian, who had disappeared on a case near 30 years ago. I looked at the journal now with new eyes. This thing could be worth some cash, it seemed. It was more than money, though, by this point. The more I read about Killian, the more intrigued I became. This guy had stopped everything from hitmen to drug lords, and most of it seemed to be because he was at the right place at the right time and knew the right thing to do. His journal entries made him sound idealistic, if not a bit naive, and I wanted to know more about him. More importantly, I wanted to know what had happened to him. I flipped to the end, the last few pages looking harried and sloppy, and found the entry I was looking for. The pages were smudged, but I could still read his meticulous notes as he detailed the case he'd begun on September 8th, 1981.
September 8th, 1981. I knew it was only a matter of time before Chief Walker came to us. We had been monitoring the Lost Lamb case files with some interest for the past few weeks. 15 missing children, all of them from different walks of life, but the police didn't take much notice until Jessica Bradley went missing. She didn't fit the usual pattern. She was from an upper-class family and would be missed. All those before her had just been from poor families, low-income houses, or street families that lived on the fringes. Dom and I had been beating the pavement, talking to these families, but now that someone who mattered had gone missing, I guess it's time for the chief to take notice. He hired us as consultants. We would find the kidnapper and turn the information over to the police. We would not involve ourselves any further than that. The police would take care of this, and there would be no need for such headlines as PD Duo Thwart Kidnapping Ring. We were working for the police, and as such would be under their supervision. Dom and I gave each other a look, silently agreeing that that was never going to happen. We began immediately. The families we had already spoken to had given us a pretty good starting place. All the kids, including Jessica, had been connected by their time spent at Little Lamb's house, a children's home/daycare center where Jessica often volunteered. The police suspected that the home was a front for some sort of shady dealings, but they couldn't prove anything. It looks like a great place to start for Dom and me.
The next 2 pages were stuck together pretty badly. They had become wet and were nearly fused together. I tried to pry them apart carefully, but as they came free, I could see some of the ink on the paper had come free with them. The first page was almost ruined, the date showing up as September 10th of the same year, but I could make out a few words scattered through the damage. I gleaned that they had gone to the children's home, asking questions of a childminder that he usually called Minder, and been asked to leave. They had stalked out of the building, but had found out very little. Dom thought they ought to speak with some of the families that let the kids stay there, but Killian wanted to break into the minder's office and see if he could find anything incriminating. I mulled over the information. The case seemed pretty cut and dry from here. Killian had the information he needed. He could simply pass it to the police and the case would be solved, right? The next few pages revealed how wrong I had been. Chief Walker needed more, it seemed. 5 nondescript white men in suits didn't give him a lot to go on. Dom struck out with his line of questioning. All the kids had been snatched from the home itself, and most of the parents were too distraught to be of much help. The next few pages were ruined. The waterlogged pages stuck together like flypaper, and parting them just seemed to muddy and ruin the message worse. They seemed to be covered in the same gunk on the bottom of the coat, dirty water or soapy mud or something. The journal picked up on September 15th, and the news was more optimistic.
September 15th, 1981. I found a lead, the first one in days. The organization that supports Little Lamb's House has been a local installation for generations. The Malden family can trace its roots back to the founding of Atlanta. They've been giving money to local businesses since this town was a wagon track. I saw a picture of their latest patron, Dexter Malden, and he was a dead ringer for the man I saw yelling at the minder that night. I may have stumbled onto some kind of child trafficking ring or underage sex scandal. Whatever he wants those children for, it can't be good. Dom thinks we should be careful with this information, but I say the sooner we bring it to light, the better. He's as eager to stop this pervert as I am, but the Maldens are an ancient and distinguished family. We need to bring the police into this. Bring the arm of justice down on their heads, and prove that money doesn't buy your way out of everything.
The next few pages came away easily, and I'm glad they did. The writing was blocky and scratched. Killian seemed to be very angry at whatever exchange he had had with the chief of police. His pen had nearly poked through the paper several times.
September 17th, 1981. Removed. We've been removed from the case. We took our findings to Chief Walker, and he proceeded to get his ducks in a row to talk to Mr. Malden. We returned to the office, expecting justice would be served. They would find the kids, and that would be that. Even if they didn't find them, they would find evidence to prove that it was them, and the appropriate parties would be taken in custody. Case closed. What we hadn't planned on was that the spineless chief of police would call us and tell us to back off. He said that Maldron's alibi was airtight and that we needed to leave this case alone. He removed us from the case, paid our outstanding fee, and told us he would call us if we needed any more help. If I'm honest, he sounded a little scared, too. Well, I won't be scared off this case. Maldron knows something, and I'll be damned if I let him turn me off the scent. I don't know what he's up to, but I mean to find out. Don wants to put it all behind us. We've been paid, let's just go, he says. Well, to hell with that. I'm going to solve this case, even if it kills me.
The next few entries, what I could read of them, were mostly supplemental. Killian sniffed out the leads, Dom tried to dissuade him, and Killian continued to pound the pavement. It was becoming like a real mystery story to me. Killian, in his devil-may-care attitude, Dom, the brave but cautious sidekick, and Dexter Maldon as Killian's foil. The two played a game of cat and mouse that seemed to infuriate Killian to no end. Maldon was very careful about cleaning up after himself, and Killian began to worry that he was going to be noticed. Then one night, things went off the rails. Killian got himself attacked.
September 23rd, 1981. I was working on the Lost Lamb case, despite what the Chief and Dom want. This case is deeper than I ever imagined, and it gets twistier the deeper I go. You see, Little Lamb's house is not the first children's home that Maldron has had a stake in. Every 8 to 10 years, he suddenly becomes interested in the plight of children. Orphanages, children's homes, halfway houses, children's hospitals, you name it. 10 years ago, there was another string of disappearances at Pine Rise that are reminiscent of this very crime. I tracked down a janitor that used to work there, an old man now. He told me a fascinating story about his time at Pine Rise. He told me about the night when the sound of crying children had woken him. He had been staying on the ground. He was their 24-hour caretaker, and his room was on the top of the stairs and overlooked the gathering area right in front of the double doors. Pine Rise had a grand staircase. It had once been a plantation house, and the double doors opened onto a large entryway that was overlooked by a wide, sweeping balcony. He remembered rising from bed, thinking that some of the children were out of bed past curfew, and walking out onto that balcony to see men herding children out into the cold October air. They were still in their night clothes, barefoot and frightened, but the men pushed them along without a second thought. One of the men looked up then, sensing the janitor's eyes on him. The janitor had recognized Dexter Maldron, the smiling man who had come just 2 days before to judge a sports day event for the little ones. He looked resplendent in his pinstripe suit, and he'd come up the stairs to put the man's cares to rest personally. He had heard I was looking for information on Maldron, God knows from where, and he had come to see me. He called me back tonight to tell me a very different story. He called me just before sunset and told me he needed my help. He said he was being followed. He said that something was tailing him, men or things or something, and he needed my protection. I asked him where he was, and he gave me the name of a bar about 20 minutes up the road. I pulled on my hat and headed out, the car grumbling pitifully about the cold as we drove. It was going to be a real howler this winter, you can already tell, but I don't think it'll get any colder than it did tonight for me. I can still feel that chill even now. When I pulled up to the bar, I saw the old duffer being walked into the alley by a broad fellow in a pork pie hat. He looked like a real outfit type, a hitter. I suddenly wondered if it was all about kids. Was the mob involved in this somehow? Maybe I was in too deep. I shoved my .38 in my coat, though, and went off after them. I'd worry about the details later. They were at the end of the alley, and I had just gotten my gun out and started to yell at them when I saw what they were doing. The big guy had his hands around the old guy's upper arms, hard enough to break bones, and the old guy was staring up at him like he was a serpent prepared to devour him. Then the thug's head and shoulders peeled back like a rotten banana, and what came out was so much worse than the porcine face that had been there. He was a living shadow, his skin like TV static and his eyes like fireplace coals. He opened his shifting mouth to reveal sewing needle teeth and a tongue like a boa constrictor. The teeth sank into the old man's face, and his scream was drank up by the hissing maw. It didn't eat him. Not really. The old man turned into that same static, his skin going the off-white of eggshell paint, and suddenly it was wafting into the creature as it slurped him up like a milkshake. The old man's clothes hit the ground when he finished with him, and my scream finally careened up my throat. It may have turned and looked at me, but I was already running by that point. I hopped in my car and was peeling up the road before my heart went below 160 miles an hour. I have never been afraid of anything. Not since I was old enough to know that people are the scariest thing out there. I've stepped into the ring with men who could have easily crushed me like a bug. I've gone up against men with more power than I can even dream of. I have never feared death. Death comes for all of us, whether we like it or not. God help me. I feared that thing.
The next few entries were Killian in Haddon. He was terrified that something was now following him, that the creature had seen him, and that any minute it would come driving through the door to have him. He was drunk more than he was sober, his notes often confusing, or his passages stained with alcohol as much as mud. He was a mess, his writing filled with fear and dismay. He was lost, his mooring having come undone, and it seemed that the case might have ended there, until he received the phone call.
October 1st, 1981. Final entry. I'm sitting in the parking lot of a campground in Panola State Park. The parking lot is full of expensive-looking cars. I hunkered down as I watched them lead kids into the woods about 2 minutes ago. I'm about to dog their heels once I get done laying out this last little refrain. The minder called me back today. He was crying, and if he's still alive tomorrow, I'll be astonished. He told me about how Malden had come to him, told him of his need, and told him how he could give him what he needed.
No, not even give them to him. He told me that I would stand aside and let them be taken. He told me I'd do these things, or he'd kill me.
Then he showed the man what he and his cronies truly were, and the minder had little choice but to step aside.
They ain't human, Mr. Barger. They're servants of something old and dark. He comes with the cold, they said, and he's ushered in by blood. The blood of the innocent will make him strong. The blood of the innocent will secure his power. They said I'd let them be taken, or I would be given to him as well.
And who is him? I asked, not really wanting the answer.
They didn't say his name. Wouldn't say his name. He's the one who comes from Strange. He's the one who ushers in the frost. He's the one who brings the change.
Why tell me this now? I asked.
Because tonight they will take the children to him. They will be gone after tonight, and maybe you can stop them, Mr. Barger. I certainly hope so.
He told me where they meant to go, and then he hung up. My .38 feels good in my hand right now. I'm preparing to make my way into the fire now and find out just what the hell is going on. If I don't come back, I hope whoever finds this knows what to do with it. If they do, tell Dom I'm sorry. If I don't make it out, tell him I hope he nails this son of a bitch.
And that was that, the last entry. I don't know what became of Killian Barger, but the news on the TV leads me to believe that it's happening again. They're calling them the Green Man killings, and if these kids were taken by the same group of wackos that are perpetuating these grisly killings, then I can guess what must have happened to Killian and those kids. I'm on my way to Atlanta with the journal now. I've been getting some pretty weird texts from my boss for the last few hours, though. He wants to know what happened to the box in the back room. He's curious to know if I moved it. He's offering to waive the rest of my community service. Just pencil whip the sheet if I bring that coat back. That was a few hours ago. Now the messages are becoming a little darker. He's telling me that if I bring the coat back now, nothing bad will happen. He's asking me if I know what I've done to myself. He's asking if I want to die, or if I'm willing to be reasonable and bring that coat back. I don't think I will, though. The coat and the hat look pretty good on me as I look at myself in the rearview mirror. Besides, I want to look sharp when I deliver this journal personally. I want Dom to recognize what I'm bringing him when I take it home. When she opened the front door, her face was a study in relief. Are you the paranormal investigator the agency sent over? she asked, getting straight to the point. She had once been a very attractive woman, he had no doubt, but grief had aged her. She wore a simple pink dress with a sensible pair of black shoes poking from underneath the hem, and her chestnut hair was swept back into a messy braid. She looked like someone who had become used to living in a situation outside her control, determined, yet hopeful. He took off his hat, a tan Humphrey Bogart number, and smiled at her.
I'm from the agency, but they thought your case might need something special. That's why they sent me.
She showed him in and took his coat before leading him into the living room. She introduced her husband, Michael, a tall man with a comfortable look of middle age, and introduced herself as Barbara. She sat next to him on the couch, brushing the wrinkles from her dress as she moved effortlessly into the protective shelf of his arm. Killian settled himself into a large red chair that didn't seem to match the other furniture in the room at all. He took a notepad from his pocket and licked the end of the pencil before beginning. "Wait," Barbara said. When I invited you in, you said the agency had sent over someone special. Does that mean you aren't a paranormal investigator?" she asked. She said it carefully, as if she thought she might offend him with the question. He chuckled. He got this all the time. "The agency sent him, Barbara. I see no reason to," her husband began, but Killian put a hand out to stop him.
It's quite all right. No, ma'am, I'm not a paranormal investigator. My name is Killian Barger, and I'm what you call a paranormal facilitator.
Michael crinkled his eyebrows. "Paranormal facilitator? What's that?"
Well, an investigator usually comes out to inspect the phenomenon and see if there's anything the agency can do for the client. Given the description your wife provided on the phone, though, I'd say we have enough data to go ahead and send out a facilitator, such as myself.
But what does a facilitator do?" Barbara asked.
My training has allowed me to communicate with the presence or presences in your home and help you get rid of them.
Michael seemed shocked. "So you can speak to them?" he asked. Killian couldn't help a little chuckle.
Not exactly. We can make our presence known and inform the entity that the continued inhabitation of this home is undesired. So, tell me a little bit about what's been going on.
Killian made notes as he listened, but it was a mechanical sort of dictation. These cases seemed to run along the same course most of the time. Furniture being moved, doors and containers left open, disembodied noises or voices in the house, and an otherworldly presence felt by all who inhabited the home. He listened politely, but what he was really looking for were the ripples. Entities in the home don't appear as Barbara and Michael did. They seem to ripple in and out of existence, like stones making a ripple on a pond when it impacts the water. As they spoke, Killian saw two entities moving about the house with the calm sort of familiarity you often saw in these cases. Both seemed to be adults. One was a male who often moved between the kitchen and the back of the house, and a female who seemed to flit about the kitchen like a hummingbird as she stopped and did something with objects Killian couldn't see. He thought she might also be on the phone with someone, but all he could pick up from her ripply, wavy voice was a sense of pleasure about some new experience or event. Killian had scribbled down the words, "two-entity incursion," before Barbara reminded him that he wasn't alone. Then, there's the child sounds in the bedroom. Killian snapped back.
Child sounds?
"Yes," said Michael. "You can hear the child talking and laughing and playing at odd times in our bedroom. One night, it woke us up with the most terrible wailing. We spent the rest of the night in the living room with the door closed. Come morning, though, we went back and found the door wide open. The covers on our bed were a real mess." Killian scratched out 2 and wrote 3 as he amended the notes to reflect the presence of a child.
Very well, then. I think I can help you, but it won't be easy. It seems as though these entities have a certain amount of familiarity with the home, so I'll have to force them out.
Barbara looked at Michael in confusion before she looked back to Killian and asked, How would we even do that?"
I don't think it'll be too hard, but we may need to act quickly. I'll stay in your home tonight, if you'll allow me, and make notes on the situation. By tomorrow, I have little doubt that I'll have formed an attack plan to push these intruders from your home.
That seemed to brighten them a little, and Barbara was happy to show him to the guest room. It was a simple room. A bed, a wardrobe, a window that looked out over the backyard, but Killian didn't need much. He set his bag on the bed and began to compile his notes. This was far from his first encounter with the world beyond, and Killian had little doubt that he could help his clients. People tend to assign an almost magical quality to the other side. Still, for people like him, people who can see the ripples, it's easy to help people plagued by their entities. An hour of collecting notes and making adjustments, and Killian went out into the house to begin compiling further data. It was a very active day within the home. The sofa the couple had been sitting on earlier kept disappearing and reappearing outside on the curb. It was replaced by a red velvet love seat, the same color as the chair that he'd noticed earlier. No matter how many times Barbara and Michael took it out and brought their couch back in, it always reappeared on the curb again. Finally, they stopped trying, and Barbara fell into despair as she flopped onto the red couch. The couch was something they had bought together just after being married, and with Killian's help, they managed to move it to the side yard, where it finally stayed put. The ripples continued to move through the house. The male moved about in a state of constant action, going from living room to kitchen and then back to the back of the house with some rapidity. The female entity continued to move about the kitchen haphazardly. She then did the same around the living room for most of the afternoon. The child was not in evidence, but every now and again, Killian would hear a name called or catch a snatch of song as someone sang or hummed to themselves. He followed them with his eyes as they went about their tasks, and even though Barbara and Michael couldn't see them, Killian was pretty sure they could feel them moving around their house. That night, the activity hit a crescendo. As they sat at the dining room table, a multitude of ethereal voices came rolling out from the living room. Michael and Barbara whipped around as they looked in panic, scared by the clatter in the living room. To Killian's eyes, it was as though 100 stones had been thrown at once. Around the couch, around the TV, going towards the back, slowly trickling into the kitchen. He could see not just 2 forms, but the wavy outlines of many others. At first, he thought there might be 5, but after a few minutes, he decided it might be as many as 10. Suddenly, things began moving. Cabinets opened and closed at random. The fridge rattled under the mechanical rapidity of use. The TV blared, the microwave beeped, and all around them, the ethereal voices talked and laughed. It was all Killian could do to herd Michael and Barbara into the guest bedroom. What's going on out there?" she cried. She and Michael huddled on the bed in terror, clutching each other for comfort. "I've never seen it that bad before."
This isn't the first time I've seen something like this. The presences are getting stronger. Before long, it'll be impossible to get rid of them.
Barbara collapsed into tears, and Michael held her as the din outside rose like an angry sea. Killian watched at the door, counting the swirls and seeing the indents left on the couch. One of the swirls actually wobbled towards him and threw the door open to the horror of Michael and Barbara. Killian heard a slurry voice whisper something about a bathroom before wandering off down the hall. Finally, around midnight, it seemed to settle down. Killian suggested they get some sleep while the presences were at rest. They moved like scared rabbits down the hall, eyes flicking every which way as they went. Killian watched them until the door closed and then began to get ready for sleep himself. He threw his suit jacket over the post and put his hat on top. He kicked his shoes off and lay in the comfortable embrace of the sheets as his eyes drifted towards sleep. It had been a long day, and he was ready for some rest, if sleep would come. No sooner had he settled himself than an unearthly wail split the air. It was followed by both Michael and Barbara screaming his name. He flew off the bed and out into the hall. He ran to their bedroom and saw 2 rippling forms standing on either side of the bed. He didn't have to ask if they could see them. The ripples were steady waves of energy, and Killian could tell that they were seeing their intruders for the first time. "What's wrong, honey?" said the male presence. He was dressed in pajamas, and his hair was rumpled as though he had been roused from sleep. The other figure was clearly the female, her robe pulled around her, her long, straight hair swishing down her back. The two were on either side of the bed and seemed to be looking at something between Barbara and Michael. Suddenly, from the center of the bed, a voice of crystalline highness shivered across his ears. I saw something. I don't know what it was. The female presence leaned down and nearly fell into Barbara. Barbara scuttled away from it, and Michael pulled her to him as he switched his gaze between the two apparitions. The female presence sat up, and in her arms was a shimmering child. A girl, Killian thought, who stared at the pair on the bed as though she could see them. As Barbara and the child made eye contact, I heard her scream in a fit of panic. Her shrieks sent both the wavering apparitions stumbling back a little and made the shimmering child cry all the louder. Get out! Get out of my house! I hate you! I wish you'd leave me alone! Barbara screamed at the three of them. The rumpled man looked at the other, and both fled out into the hallway. A door slammed somewhere in the house, and Killian could hear it being locked behind them. Barbara shuddered in fear and rage and collapsed into Michael's arms, sobbing. Killian commiserated with them. It was always hard when something you couldn't fight invaded your home, but they needed to be strong now. Killian told the two of them to secure their door and get some rest while he made plans for tomorrow. He knew there would be no sleep for him as he set about making a plan of attack for the next day. He set plans and counterplans that night, covering all his angles, and when he drew back the curtains the next day, he was ready to help them. They sat in the living room, sipping coffee, and Killian could see the female presence pacing around the house. The child's presence was not far behind her, and sometimes it would stop and glance at them on the couch as though it could see them. The male presence seemed to be absent for some reason, but Killian felt sure that it would return later. The female talked to herself near constantly as the child sobbed and tugged at her. Killian tried to ignore them. Before the presences gathered again tonight, they needed a plan.
You must summon all your strength together and push them from the house.
How? Barbara said, sobbing a little, her nerves frazzled. How do we do that?
This house belongs to you two, not these things that have taken up residence here. You must focus your will and push them out before they become too strong. Summon up all your happy memories of this house. Good times, bad times, and times that brought you closer, and form them in your mind. When the time comes, we'll draw strength from these things and use them to push the malicious presences out.
So they spent the day gathering the memories that made this house a home for them. They talked about buying the house, raising their children, living, loving, enjoying their lives. They cried a lot. Killian felt like a voyeur as they wept into each other's arms. As the darkness gathered, Killian felt the male presence return and moved them to the guest room again so they could summon the last of their strength. He watched from the door as they all moved about the house. When all the presences gathered in the living room, he would be ready for them. Barbara wanted to act before they all returned, but Killian told them that this would only work if they were all here to be forced out at once. They waited for night to fall. The presences had begun to gather in the living room. The ethereal sounds of their entertainment spilled into the guest room. But tonight, the gathering was much more intimate. It was just the three of them this time, no spectral legion like before. Killian brought Barbara and Michael into the living room and stood them before the couch. Killian gave them a nod and turned off the lights in the living room. The effect on the presences was immediate. The male form, seated between the other two, looked around and brought both of the smaller forms closer to him. It was a protective gesture, but it mattered little.
Now, take the hands of each other and cast these interlopers from your home.
Michael reached for Barbara's hand, and she grasped it tightly. As they clasped hands, Killian could see a glow surrounding them, as it had encircled the presences the night before. Both seemed to pulse with light, and the forms before them began to quiver as they saw them fully. Both Michael and Barbara shouted their ire, their contempt, their rage, their sorrow at these intruders. At that moment, Killian saw them for who they really were. The waxy flesh of the recently deceased, the puffy, jaundiced skin on their face, the dark bruises beneath their eyes as their death masks were revealed. Asphyxiation, he thought, maybe a gas leak or something. But whatever the nature of their death, Their ghostly visages caused the immediate reaction in the presences before them. "Get out of our house!" they yelled repeatedly, and Killian moved up behind them to add strength to theirs. When he dropped his hands on their shoulders, he felt his own throat open again as Killian retook his true form. He'd known his death was coming in life, his killer's glee the last sight he ever saw, and he knew from years beyond the pale that it was a grisly sight indeed. The screams of the intruders nearly dwarfed the otherworldly voices of Barbara and Michael. The two larger presences grabbed their child and fled the house. The ghostly trio stood silently as the sounds of a car escaping split the night like a shrieking train. "We did it," Barbara said, both she and Michael now back in their initial state. "We did it! They're gone! We have our house back!" she cried. Both of them threw their arms around each other and laughed as they hugged and sobbed. Killian took the opportunity to fish a pamphlet out of his bag and hand it to Barbara, whose hands were shaking again.
I would suggest that you leave this place soon. If they believe what they saw here tonight, they may return with a religious or some other such person. They can banish you from this place, and believe me when I say that you would find the process very unpleasant. Yes, but I doubt it will be for long. The living are never gone very long, I'm afraid. In the light of day, they'll laugh off their fears and return to a place they must now call home. They chalk up our presence to a bit of bad dinner or a headache. As Scrooge put it, there's more of gravy than grave about you.
"Leave?" Barbara said, confused. "But where would we go?"
On to the next plane of being. Heaven, hell, Shangri-La, doesn't matter to me. But this small victory won't last long. Stay if you like. It's ultimately your decision. But know that someday you will need to pass on. Better to pass peacefully than be swept out like old trash. If you need the agency's help again, don't hesitate to ask. We're always here if you need us.
Killian collected his hat and coat and shook their hands as he parted. He opened the door and looked out into the inky blackness of the void. He had no idea what lay beyond. That's why the agency had been so keen to have him. Maybe these two could find some peace there. The living always wondered what came after death. If they knew it was this, Killian doubted so many of them would seek it. Someone said the living often envy the dead. As a member of them, he could honestly say the grass wasn't much greener on this side. Killian rechecked the address before looking up at the run-down old parking structure. 658 Throonwood Drive was a corner lot in Atlanta's business district. It should have been a towering glass edifice full of men in suits and women in blazers. It should have been a tech startup or a trendy bar. Hell, it should have been a functional parking garage at the very least. Instead, it was a crumbling 5-story concrete monstrosity. Spray paint and graffiti covered the walls, and the thick scrub grass grew up between the cracks in the cement. You could see the leavings of people, kids who had come to smoke, or homeless people looking to get out of the weather. Killian doubted that any of the people that lived around here thought about the place, beyond calling the cops if the kids got a little too rowdy or the homeless people got a little too drunk. As he stepped inside, he could already tell that it was cleaner than most places in such disarray. Homeless people stayed the night, but they never stayed for the whole night. Nicking teens and junkies looking for a place to flop did not come here after dark. Killian didn't need the little card in his pocket to tell him that this was a hot spot. Killian would wager that it practically thrummed after dark. He stepped inside the crumbling structure, stepping around the broken security arm that was there to keep the cars out until they'd paid for a ticket. Someone had snapped it in the middle, and now it just hung lamely, wobbling in the setting sun. The guard booth it fronted on had a window caked in dust, and the seat inside was a chewed hole fit only for mice. On the desk sat a lonely can of Pepsi that had likely been there for about a decade. Killian betted there was even still Pepsi in the bottom of it. He kept moving, kept looking for her. She was the reason he'd been sent here by the agency. She had caused quite a stir when she'd given a homeless man a heart attack and scared the other three nearly to death. They had run, but the man had stayed. He stayed, and she had fed on him. She had tasted life force, and that was why he was here. She was a ticking time bomb, and he was here to offer her a way back before it was too late. If it wasn't already too late, that was. He found her sitting on the hood of a rusty car on the deck below this one. In the semi-darkness, she appeared as any other little girl might. She wore a school uniform, though the garment was filthy with dirt and mud. Her dark hair hung limply in one sodden pigtail, and he could see a single bare sock dangling next to a shiny leather shoe. She sat far too still for a child, staring at the sunset through a hole in the far wall as he approached. Then, she spoke suddenly. Her voice was cultured but thick, like a delicate china doll sinking in a mud puddle.
You've come to be rid of me, haven't you?
Killian stopped. He was nearly 10 feet from her, and if something was going to happen, then he would rather it happen now. Ghosts were unpredictable at the best of times, but this little girl was no ghost. Not anymore. She was edging towards something darker, something far more destructive. If Killian couldn't stop her, then she'd be unreachable, unsavable. Then he'd have to put her down like a dog with the rabies.
Are you Madeline Arlo Register?
I am.
The agency has sent me to...
Without warning, she turned. He had seen her from the back, in profile, but as she turned, Killian realized that those stains weren't all mud. The uniform shirt was a patchwork of dried blood and old stab wounds. Someone had stabbed her a dozen times in the chest and belly. The left side of her face hung in tatters, strips of flesh hanging like grisly streamers from her soft white skull. Her left eye was dark, put out forever, but a little spark danced there now. As she turned, he saw the colossal metal frame of the car she was sitting on fly towards him. He stood his ground, best not to let the ghost see you flinch, and her sneer turned to something like confusion as the rusty hulk slid through him and slammed into the wall behind him. Killian gave her a flash of teeth.
Is that how your mother taught you to greet guests, Madeline?
She gawked at him. No mean feat with half a face.
How did you...
You're not the only one who ceased to be a person some time ago. My name is Killian Barger, and I am here to stop you before you do yourself irreparable damage.
Damage myself? Look at me. I'm slashed to bloody tatters. How much more damaged could I become?
Killian stepped in closer, not something he strictly wanted to do, and bent to eye level with this grisly shade.
If you continue on the way you are, you will cease to be a spirit. You'll become something different. You'll become something that cannot move on.
Her good eye clouded with tears then. She seemed unsure of whether to put her head against him, whether he would allow such a thing. He solved her problem by pulling her to him and letting her rest her gruesome face against his long coat. Even in life, Killian had never been one to let a child's anguish go uncomforted because of a little thing like a mess on his coat. She left no stain, of course. How could she? Madeline had been dead for 10 years now. Her worries about stains and messes were well beyond her.
I needed to kill them. We needed to kill them. We have to be stronger when he comes back.
We?
Even as he spoke, though, he could see them on the fringes of the parking garage. Maybe she wasn't afraid to sit in the light, but they still cringed from it. As full dark came, however, he saw them shuffling to see what troubled their sad guardian. Toddlers in overalls, girls in gingham dresses with blood in their curls, boys in suits, boys in undershirts, children who were in various states of undress. The dirty, grubby masses that made this place their home came shambling from the shadows and approached him. Killian could do nothing but gape at them. The agency had told him about David McGinsk, of course. The agency knew how he had murdered children since the early 50s and dumped their bodies in this parking garage when it had still been an empty lot. David was old now, an old business that many of these ghosts would have to settle before they moved on. But still, he killed them. Still, they feared him. Still, he swelled their ranks. The agency knew about the 53 children of David McGinsk, the ones he had murdered in his 67 years of life. But the agency did not involve itself in matters of the living. Killian, however, did.
When was the last time he was here?
He came back 3 months ago when he killed Angelica.
Madeline indicated a dark-haired girl with brown skin who had wandered close. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, but her head had been almost entirely obliterated. The girl stared at Killian through the dirt and grime that stained her face, her smushed face that resembled a Halloween jack-o'-lantern that had begun to rot and collapse. She stared at him like she thought Killian might raise her from the dead.
He drove by yesterday. He only drives by to case the place right before he brings someone new here.
I need to go make a call. When he comes, I want you to call me on this.
Killian handed her a small silver whistle from his pocket, and Madeline looked at the object dubiously.
A whistle?
Killian smiled at her.
You know how to whistle, don't you? Just put your lips together and blow.
Dom filled the glass with whiskey and took a long pull. The Casey Reed disappearance was a real pain in the ass. 4 different agencies, the state police, the local yokels, and even the feds were involved in this citywide search for Casey. Casey, the archetypally rebellious 13-year-old girl, also happened to have a pair of wealthy parents and a grandfather who was a councilman. If even half the disappearances Dom had investigated in the last 10 years had been from families as wealthy as these, Dom was confident they would have gotten this monster off the street by now. That's right, despite what Captain Cedric thought of the idea, Dom was confident that all of these crimes were connected. Children had been going missing in the less affluent areas for the past 30 years. Most of them amounted to dead ends and cold cases, but Dom had personally found many of them buried in the lot on Thronewood. The police, of course, didn't want to hear about some pervert who targeted kids from low-income families. They wanted results, and Dom could only give them closure instead of arrests. God, but he'd been close with Madeline Register. A private school girl goes missing, parents come to him for results, but yet again, the bastard had slipped through his fingers. He'd nearly had him then, had a make and model on the car, a witness placing him at the private school on the day of the disappearance. He'd been so close, but the he was what eluded him. The guy was a ghost, never leaving more than a residual impression on people, and when the car had come up as little more than a burnt husk, Dom had been all out of clues. Killian would have been able to find him, Dom said, topping off his glass again. Killian had been the best detective at the agency, the best cop on the force, and the best friend Dom had ever had. Without Killian, Dom felt like he was just barely getting by. He knocked back the whiskey and glanced at his partner's old chair. He'd left it just the way Killian had before going missing 8 years ago. After 8 years, you just gave up on ever seeing someone again. But not a day went by that Dom didn't hope that Killian would walk through that door again, and Dom's glass smacked roughly against the floor of the small apartment. Killian was sitting in the chair, hands steepled behind his head, staring at Dom from behind his old battered desk, just like he had in the old days.
It's been a while, Dom.
Killian, what the hell, man? You can't just... Where have you been for the last 8 years? Dom took in his old friend and found that Killian looked exactly the same as the day he'd left to chase his final lead. His coat was immaculate, his salt and pepper hair still snug against his hat, and his face... You dead, aren't you? Dom asked, picking up his glass and filling it again.
I'm afraid so. Turns out there's still a place for gumshoes like us, though. Even on the other side, there are people in need of a keen eye and a quick mind.
Dom mulled that over as he drank. Dom wasn't young, and seeing Killian had probably brought him one step closer to his inevitable grave. It gave him a queer sort of comfort, though, knowing that the light didn't just go out after you stopped paying the bills. Something after death wasn't news you got handed every day. So, why are you here? Dom asked, trying to find his cool again.
I've got a lead for you, partner. A lead that I imagine will help you find Casey Reed.
Dom pricked up his ears. Yeah, well, I sure could use one. Every cop in the damn city's looking for her. I know her parents would love to have her home for more than just a viewing.
David Majensk has her.
Dom's eyebrows shot way up. I investigated him a couple of years ago. He was a prime suspect in that string of abductions, but it just never panned out. He had an airtight alibi, and people to back it up.
He has friends who are afraid of him, people who will lie on his behalf. He's the one who's been leaving bodies at the old Thronewood site.
He's the one dumping bodies? Dom was shocked. He'd have to have been killing
since he was 17 years old.
Dom sat back in his chair and sipped at his whiskey. And I suppose that telling the cops that the ghost of my dead partner came and told me this won't amount to a hill of beans and only serve to get me locked in the local mental ward.
Afraid so. Looks like you'll have to go and do the legwork if you want to see this case put to bed.
Killian flashed that careworn smile he had always worn, and it warmed Dom's heart to see it. He stood up, taking his hat off the desk, and turned back to look at an empty seat. "Thanks, partner," he smiled. Killian had given him a hell of a lead, and now it was time to chase it. How much had Atlanta changed in the 8 years since he'd lived there? The people bustled up and down the streets. The towering glass buildings winked and glistened even by night, and the hum and thrum of the streets still moved him towards his old haunts. He was standing outside a tavern near his office. It had been called Saffron, but it was now a small wine bar named Genesis. How many nights, how many times had he sat inside with Dom and had a beer? How many times had Sandra, Saffron's bartender, come out after last call to talk about the old neighborhood with them? Was she still there, he wondered, slinging wine and talking about the old days? He had taken a step towards the front window when an ear-splitting whistle raked across his senses. He stepped away and turned towards the business district. His curiosity would have to wait. He was on the clock, after all. David pulled into the familiar spot beside the old lot and shut off the lights. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath as he savored the feel of the moment. He liked to emblazon this part in his mind, so later, when he was alone in his bed, he could recall it with crystalline clarity. He held the knife up to inspect it, opening his eyes to see the keen blade, the rough wooden handle that was still stained from a lifetime of killing. Then, the bitch in the back seat kicked his seat and ruined his moment. She had been impossible from the first moment he had found her on the sidewalk. When he stumbled across her, David had thought himself lucky. Here was someone whom he wouldn't have to lure into his car or trick into his house with the promise of treats or money. The girl was passed out on the sidewalk, a raging house party thrumming in the background. He had loaded her into his car with minimal effort and thought himself quite lucky. When she had awakened halfway to his house, however, the trouble had begun. She had kicked and screamed and accused him of any number of improper things. He had barely managed to find the sedative in his glove box, plunging the needle into her neck as she tried to pull his door handle off. But that was far from the end of it. The last 3 days were a constant reminder of why David did not abduct teenagers. They were loud, they were rude, and they generally could not easily be cowed by fear or violence. Every other word out of her mouth was an expletive, or her telling him how much he probably wanted to screw her. David shuddered at the thought of it. He was not a sex pervert. He did not like to have sex with children. He was, however, a murderer, and he was about to receive his climax. He took her out of the back seat, trussed and gagged, and carried her into the garage. She struggled. The stupid brats always struggled. Why couldn't they be quiet, like the little angels he usually brought down here? Most of them went sobbing quietly, or just limp in resignation. Not all of them, though. That little bitch with the pigtails had kicked him in the face just before he could put her down. Oh, that had made him mad. He'd been madder still when he realized that she was trying to escape. Well, he had shown her, hadn't he? He usually liked to do them quick. One quick cut across the neck or one quick jab to the throat. But this little bitch had made him really mad. He'd put the knife in her eye, hard enough to pop it like a grape. Then he had dug the knife down in the socket, cutting her face into a grim caricature as she thrashed and screamed around the gag he had stuffed in her mouth. Then he had stabbed her over and over and over until, finally, the knife blade had snapped into the pavement under her. He flopped his latest victim down onto the pavement, hard enough to bounce her head. That had been a wake-up call for him. Not to stop killing, but, to curb his lack of control. He had the knife repaired after he dug the tip out of the girl's chest. Now, when he looked at the patched part, He felt a calm come over him, and he knew that he needn't hurry. As he looked down at the girl as she struggled, David knew he had all night if he needed. When the rock smashed into the back of his head, he spun around in sudden anger. He could feel the blood rushing from the back of his scalp, but as he scanned the parking deck, he could see no one. As he stood tracking, his knife held out offensively, another rock struck him in the side of the head. He staggered, turning in the direction the stone had come from. Now he saw her. She was standing on a rusty old car that had been there since the 70s, and her arm was still extended from the throw. She was in some kind of school uniform, a costume probably. His eye was blurry. The rock had hit close to the eye, but he thought maybe she looked familiar. When she lifted her head to grin at him, he knew why. He took a step back, a scream rising in his throat. It couldn't be her. She was dead. He had killed her. He had put her eye out and torn her face and stabbed her until he could see the shadows lengthening from behind her as a wave of bodies rose from the blackness. The hands, the torn and bloodied hands, rose like a column of dark beneath her. The children, his angels, they began to boil from the shadows of the dark garage. Their eyes were like dark pools with no bottoms, and their faces held none of the joy he would have expected. They had been street children, unwashed, unloved. He had sent them on to something better. He was their savior, their provider, He tripped over the struggling body of his soon-to-be latest victim, but she hardly seemed to matter. The throng of children was approaching, that pigtailed apparition pushing them onward, and he knew a fear that he had never known before. Not when the police had come to talk to his daddy after he'd killed his first. Not after the state police had pulled him over when he had that girl in the trunk in 73. Not even when his daddy had come to him drunk one night and made him feel as shameful as his mother always had. He loosed a high and warbled scream and crab-walked backwards on his palms. The mob was coming for him, rolling over the trussed girl as they came for him, and the lights from the street suddenly flickered and grew dark. A figure stood amongst them, his long form denoting an adult, and he glared at David with the eyes of an avenging angel. He had passed judgment on David, sentenced him to a hell worse than any lake of fire, and now he would pay for his crimes. The small hands clutched at him, nails digging into him as they drew him into their miasma. As they carried him away, they brought him face to face with the pigtailed general. As he reclined before her, held in place by his many victims' hands, she stood over him with her torn face a leering mask. She lifted the knife over him, David wondering when he had lost it, as the steel rose to take him as he had taken so many. The ruined side of her face wore a terrible smile, her other side a frozen mass of tissue, and she plunged the knife downward in a slow arc. A bright light suddenly washed over him, and he could hear many voices advising him to freeze. David opened his eyes. He was surrounded by no less than 30 ununiformed policemen, all pointing guns at him and telling him to put down the knife and step away from the girl. He looked down and found that he was crouching over the bound girl, crotch inches from her struggling chest, as he prepared to run the blade down and end her life. Where were the children? Where was the avenging angel? What had happened? Something hit him in the chest, and he fell backwards onto the ramp. Someone had shot him with a beanbag launcher, a blow that would leave him with a terrible bruise that wouldn't heal for weeks. The police were on him then, laying rough hands on him and putting cold steel cuffs on his wrists. They were untying his victim. They were taking her away. As he struggled, someone put a fist in his stomach and he nearly vomited. He slumped, which gave him a prime view of the two-faced girl between the crook of a policeman's arm. She waved cheerily at him as he went into the back of a squad car, and David moved to look out the window, hoping to see her again. But he never saw another child again for the rest of his life. Not in life, anyway, and the ones he saw after death were no angels. Dom smiled as Captain Cedric shook his hand. It was done grudgingly, and only after Counselor Reed had given his whole arm a heartfelt pump. The press drugged the counselor away then, and Cedric stood next to the grizzled detective as the two waited their turn. "How in the blue hell did you know where to find that girl?" Cedric breathed. Dom only shrugged, but the satisfied smile just wouldn't leave him. "Just plain old detective work, Cedric. You used to know what that was, as I recall." Cedric kept his smile, but there was a sneer hidden beneath it. "Don't give me that shit. We comb the whole city in half a hell, and you find this girl by, what, pounding the pavement, hassling toughs down at the dock?" Dom let his eyes roam over to the parking garage. "I've been telling you about the bodies dumped here for almost 15 years now, haven't I? Yeah, and we ID the remains, but we never catch anyone coming to dump. Well, I've liked David McGinsk for the dumper for quite some time now, a tidbit I shared with you as well." Cedric did grimace that time. "Yes, and a tidbit that we researched and found to be most unlikely. The guy had alibis and witnesses, and he had people willing to lie for him, that's all. I found a source willing to talk, willing to tell me how his old man actually owned this parking garage. When his old man died a few decades ago, the garage went to his only living relative, young David here. He owns the place. He knows where he can and can't dump the bodies, and he could easily come up with an excuse for being there." "And your witness told you all that?" Cedric asked. "Mind putting a name to this solid citizen?" Dom's eyes widened a little, but when he looked back at the crumbling third story of the garage, the figure was gone. For a second, he could have sworn he'd seen a familiar coat up there. "Sorry, Cap. My sources are strictly off the books." From the roof, Killian and Madeline watched the cop cars roll away. Now we'll get what's coming to him, Killian thought. No quick death for David McGinsk. He'll have plenty of time to think about his actions before the end. At least, Killian hoped so. David McGinsk had a lot to think about. Madeline didn't look at him, just watched the cop cars as they rolled away.
So, what happens now?
Now, you must come with me to the agency.
With you?
Your charges should be able to move on now, their business at an end. You, however, have killed the living, and must now answer for your crimes.
She looked away, tears falling from her good eye. When she cried, Killian really could believe that she was only a 10-year-old girl. He could see the bright young lady she had been, the potential that was wasted when a madman had ended her on the bricks below, and he felt sorry for her. He lifted her chin, and she looked at him, hopeful again.
I believe that, given the circumstances, they may go easy on you. But you must face what you've done with the same bravery that you faced your killer.
I'm ready.
She stood, taking his hand and walking away stoically with him, as the two of them walked into the aether, together. The streets thrummed around him as Killian walked past droves of laughing children. The streetlights buzzed placidly, the moon a full and watchful eye overhead. Around him, superheroes and princesses, ninjas and pop stars, soldiers, sports players ran willy-nilly. It was the barely controlled chaos that Killian had missed on the other side. He'd invited Dom to come out too, but Dom was out at an event with his granddaughter, and Killian wouldn't have taken him away from it for the world. As he looked down at the young girl holding his hand, Killian realized he had someone to share the night with anyway. Halloween was special to the spirits in Killian's neck of the woods. Halloween was a time when ghosts could leave the hereafter and walk amongst the living without a day pass. Killian raised his hand to a pair of smiling oldsters as they followed a pair of children with their parents, and they waved back emphatically. The living still couldn't see them, but sometimes they could catch a glimpse of them. Kids especially had a habit of seeing spirits as they walked, and Killian made a concentrated effort to keep his death mask on. No sense ruining the kid's night by having to look at his spooky mug.
So Madeline, what do you think of your first Halloween?
Madeline looked up at him with a smile, but it was the sad smile of a child who's grown too old for magic. She looked at the children around her with jealousy, but also with pity. That smile asked if Any of them knew how fragile they were, and Killian wondered how many of them might end up at the same fate that she had tonight.
It's fine. I never really got to walk about like this when I was alive. Mother was always afraid that someone would pick me up off the street if she let me out of her sight. I guess maybe she was right.
What's life without risk, I suppose? These little goblins seem to be having fun.
Madeline looked at them, her eyes taking in the sea of colorful costumes as they swirled around her.
Did your mother ever take you out trick-or-treating?
The pair turned a corner, and Killian saw a woman sitting on the stoop of a lonely tenement. The windows were dark, many broken out, and the kiddos seemed to be giving it a wide berth. There was a bowl on her lap, and her expression looked as sad and speculative as Madeline's.
A few times. She always insisted on hovering around me when we went out. It got so annoying that I stopped asking to go anywhere.
And your dad?
Madeline looked like something terrible had gotten stuck in her throat.
My father wasn't home much. He was always off on business. I don't think he visited more than once a week. When I got into that private, I think that was the proudest I had ever seen him. I saw him a few more times before I died. I wonder if he went to my funeral.
Killian steered her towards the lady with the bowl, as he attempted to steer her away from the conversation. The woman looked up as they approached, and Killian could see the slash across her throat for the briefest moment. She righted herself quickly enough, holding the bowl out so they could take the candy inside. They were pale beneath the wrapper and swirled white beneath the cloudy cellophane. Madeline took one, looking up at Killian before unwrapping it.
It's okay. This is 1 year, you won't have to check.
The detective assured her, popping the sweet into his mouth and staggering as the confection drifted over him. He was small, early teens maybe, watching people walk by on the street. The leaves were a vibrant technicolor orange, and the apartment across the street was festooned with pumpkins and bats and bales of hay. His mother was making caramel apples and wrapping homemade candies like the one that he had taken from the bowl. His mother smiled at him as he looked up from the pot he was stirring, and when she looked at him, she made a face that told him how much she loved him without saying a word. Killian staggered a little, Madeline's fingers sliding out of his as she wobbled. Ghost food was like that. Spirits didn't usually have access to things like flour, sugar, or an oven, so they made food from their memories. Spirits don't eat, but it's like having comfort food when you're feeling down. The sweets this woman was handing out had been lovingly crafted from her memories of better times, when the neighborhood wasn't a place you could have your throat cut for the change in your pocket. Killian took hold of Madeline's hand again, the girl's eyes still a little glassy from the shock of the sweets, and he thanked the woman, who nodded mutely in response.
Not used to spirit food, eh?
Madeline shook her head.
I've been in the asylum since you rescued me. I saw the children in the shed make such things for each other, but I never had any. Why bother? We were dead.
Killian nodded, understanding what should have been obvious. This little trip had been authorized by her minders, and they hoped it would do her some good. Madeline had broken one of the agency's cardinal rules, and a member of the living had died because of it. She had promptly broken another as she fed on his dwindling life force. She was a child in every sense of the word, a new spirit who had no idea what was going on. But that didn't matter to the agency. They had sent Killian to destroy her, but Killian had come back with a damaged little girl, pleading with his handlers for clemency. Madeline had found sanctuary within the asylum, a place the agency used to rehabilitate wayward spirits. But Madeline was now a sword that hung over Killian's head constantly. When the minder had asked if Killian would escort Madeline out tonight, Killian had never even considered refusing. Since being allowed to visit her, Killian often found himself at the asylum, and the two had become fast friends.
Do you think we could go to the parking structure?
She seemed almost shy about asking, and Killian had to think about it for a minute.
No, kid. Are you sure you really want to go back to that place? Can't be a lot of good memories there.
I know, but I want to make sure that all the kids moved on. Could we maybe stop by, please?
It was the please that did it. That childish trill made it sound like she wanted nothing more than an ice cream cone or a new toy. She looked up at him so nakedly, wanting to see a familiar place that she had once known so well. Killian realized that he had time, had nothing but time, and when he nodded, her face lit up.
Maybe it'll do you good to see old friends again.
Madeline laughed, making her usual serious face look young again.
Seems more like visiting a battered women's shelter you used to stay at often, but I'd still like to see it.
Killian oriented himself, trying to figure out how far the old parking structure was from their current location. They were in one of the less rough neighborhoods in Atlanta, and the car park was about 12 blocks from here if you figured right. The two of them could be there before midnight, but only just, and only if they hurried. He had told the minders that he would have her back before dawn, and Killian felt sure they had enough time to get there and back again. They set out, following the signs that Killian knew, as the trick-or-treaters began to thin out. It was getting late. The lights in the houses were going off as 9 o'clock grew later and later, and as the kids went in, the regular night traffic began to come out again. None of them looked twice at Killian or Madeline, if they could see them at all, and the two walked past abandoned tenements and crumbling storefronts as they made their way towards the industrial park. Madeline was quiet as they went, her mind likely stuck on where they were going. Killian couldn't blame her. It would be like going back to the place he died. It would be uncomfortable, almost voyeuristic, and then there was the fact that Killian couldn't remember where exactly he had died. He always saw it in dreams, like a half-remembered memory. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but Killian suspected it had much to do with his unfinished business.
Have you ever gone back to the place you died?
Killian jumped a little, pulled out of his own contemplation by his curiosity, and the fact that it seemed like she'd been reading his mind.
Can't say as I have, kid.
Why not? Are we not supposed to return to the place we died? Is it against the rules?
Quite the opposite, actually. Most spirits haunt the place they died exclusively. No, I can't remember where I died. I woke up in the reception room of the agency and have only foggy memories of dying at all.
Madeline thought about this as they walked, and it was part of the reason that Killian heard the ghost boy in the first place. He heard sobbing before they even rounded the corner, and was just starting to look for the source when he saw the kid. Sitting on a stoop, colorful bucket in hand, there was a sobbing ghost. He looked about 8 or 9, his costume a classic white sheet with a pair of eye holes cut out so he could see through. His jeans and sneakers were visible beneath, and Killian could see that one of them had a heel that was just about ready to fall off. Madeline let go of Killian's hand and went to him instinctively.
It's no good, kid. He probably can't even...
But the boy looked up in alarm as Killian spoke, dropping his bucket as he tried to backpedal away from Madeline.
It's okay. We won't hurt you. Are you lost? Do you need some help?
The boy nodded slowly, as if hypnotized, reaching for his bucket as he held it up like a shield before him.
Can you tell us why you're crying?
Killian kept his distance as Madeline questioned the kid, trying not to spook him. I lost my way home, the little ghost stuttered. I know it's around here somewhere. Could you help me?
Do you think we have time?
Madeline asked, looking back at Killian. Killian checked his watch, the cracked face showing him that it was 5 till 10.
I think we do, as long as the poor tyke lives around here somewhere.
Madeline smiled at him, taking his hand and clutching it in hers.
My name's Madeline, and this is my friend, Killian. We're going to help you get home. Do you know what direction it is?
The little ghost boy shook his head, Killian seeing that the front of his ghost sheet was wet with tears.
Well, do you know what street you live on?
He started to shake his head, but then stopped. Not exactly, but I know it's named after a red flower. Mama used to grow them in the window box of our apartment. She said the street was named after them. Killian nodded.
Shouldn't be too hard to figure out. There's a collection of streets nearby named after flowers. Rose, zinnia, azalea, hibiscus.
That's it, hibiscus. I live in an apartment on hibiscus. Killian thought about it and realized that hibiscus was a little out of their way. It wasn't in the opposite direction or anything, but it wasn't exactly on the way either. They would need to take some creative shortcuts once they returned the kid to his apartment. But Killian was still pretty sure that they could get to the car park by about 1 or 2. Madeline came down the stairs, leading her new friend by the hand, and Killian marveled at her control. It had taken him a while to learn how to do that kind of thing, and here she was, leading this boy around like it was nothing. To be fair, though, she had thrown a car at him on their first encounter, so maybe it was just something that came with the territory.
Off we go,
Killian said, and the three of them started walking down the darkening street. The street lamps were hit or miss here, the boy looking cautiously at the pockets of humanity that had gathered in the dark spots. This was where the sharks waited to ambush their prey, the peddlers and the hawkers waiting for their next victim, and those who had nothing to trade congregated to sell the only thing they had left. Madeline patted the boy's hand throughout it all, telling him to be brave as they progressed through the crowded street. When they took the corner onto Zinnia, the boy's steps got steadier, realizing he was almost home. They were crossing a section of pavement illuminated by the greasy window of a 24-hour market when Killian felt the scream rocket up his spine. The alley between the shop and the shuttered pharmacy was lit in ghostly green by a light from inside the dark back room of said pharmacy. It made the space look ghostly, and it made the pair in the alley look all the more ethereal. The woman was against the far wall of the alley, a pair of garbage cans hemming her in as she set her back against the disgusting bricks. The man standing over her was wearing a hockey mask, his body wide and thick, the long knife held in one meaty paw. He was laughing in the face of her screams, the knife looking small in his huge grip as he stalked in. "Someone help!" the girl yelled, the cans rattling as she tried to squeeze herself between the crumbling fissures in the wall. "Look around you, dear. It's just the two of us. No one's coming to help you." Killian took a step forward before remembering that he was little better than vapor. He couldn't help this woman. She was of the material world, and Killian of the spirit world. However, when he looked back at the little ghost boy and his young ward, the sheeted boy's words were unmistakable and galvanized Killian like nothing else could. He kept repeating the words, "Big sister," again and again. When Killian stepped into the alley, he heard his boots grating on the concrete.
Hey, No-Neck, step away from the girl. You won't get a second warning.
The masked man turned, the grip on his knife now looking foolish. "You a cop? 'Cause unless you got some backup in that stupid coat, you might want to back off. Unless you can drop me with that first shot. I don't think you stand a chance against..." But he stopped talking as Killian let his death mask drop. Whatever he had seen before, Killian's bloated face and bloody visage took away all his confidence. As Killian leveled that .38 at him, he watched the barrel smoke and the chamber glow as he prepared to blast him with a bullet that may or may not do a damn thing. Killian pulled the trigger, and a fireball the size of a barn door shot out the end. The masked man stepped back, the knife falling from his numb fingers as the fireball struck him and passed through. Killian stood, ready to fire again, as the hulking brute shuddered and gasped in his tracks. The girl was still prone between the cans, the blast having never touched her, and when the big galoot fell sideways in a dead faint, she stared at Killian in disbelief. She had just started to rise when the small ghost hit her around the waist, and she shrieked in fright. She looked down at him as Killian reapplied his death mask, and Madeline stepped up beside him. She slipped her hand into his, and for the briefest of moments, Killian felt something stir in his stomach, like he'd eaten some kind of spirit delicacy. He was standing at the gates of a large campus, which looked exclusive and expensive. He was feeling nervous. What if they didn't like him? What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't cut it here and embarrassed himself? When a warm hand slid into his, he suddenly felt safe. The man the hand belonged to had never made him feel safe before, but he was aware that this was a feeling he had wanted all his life. His mother had tried her best, but he had always secretly longed for this feeling of security. The man looked down at him, and suddenly it was Killian looking down at himself. He blinked, and when the sensation had cleared, Madeline was looking up, the look familiar to the one she had worn when her father had taken her hand. Killian squeezed her hand gently, having never felt anything like that before with just a touch.
Come on. We'll help you and your brother get home.
Killian and Madeline had walked over to help the poor girl up, but she couldn't take her eyes off the little ghost. Too shocked for words, she just nodded and accepted his hand. She walked numbly up the road to their apartment, the little ghost holding her hand the whole way. The apartment was ablaze like a sun as they approached, the front porch light reaching well into the street. The door opened as the young woman mounted the stairs, and someone who could have only been her mother wrapped the young woman in a hug, telling her she thought the worst when she was late. In the harsh light, Killian could see that the boy's sister was in a uniform of some kind. She'd been coming home from work when that slime had fallen on her for his own sick amusement. Killian was glad that they had been able to help her. He looked down at the ghost, expecting that he would run to his mother as well, but he was still standing there, watching the two of them as they embraced. "I was so scared, especially after what happened to your brother. I can't lose both of you. Not tonight. Not like this." The girl looked back at the sidewalk where she had left the little group, and looked confused when she couldn't find anybody. "That's what I wanted to show you, Mom. I saw Bradley tonight. He has this new friend who saved me. I don't..." She pushed away and looked up and down the street. "I don't understand where he was. He's right here. He was right here," she yelled, looking around frantically. Killian looked down at the little ghost and realized what he should have from the start. The sheet, which had looked so pristine, was actually speckled in red and brown. The sneaker sole wasn't coming off. It was completely missing. One arm was visible through the sheet because of the long cut in it, and the arm was a red ruin. One eye was dark and full of blood, but the other blue eye looked at him knowingly, understanding that Killian could see through his death mask. The front porch light went out as his mother pulled his sister inside, the girl still calling for her little brother, before the door cut them off. The boy looked up at him, putting himself back to rights, and Killian could see his smiling eyes from the holes of the sheet. "Thanks, mister. I wanted to see my mom and sis again, even if it's just for a minute. I knew I couldn't go inside, and I knew that she probably wouldn't be able to see me, but I just wanted to see them so badly. When I couldn't find the street, I felt so sad, knowing I'd missed my chance. I'm so glad you came along when you did, you and your daughter." Killian thought about correcting him, but when Madeline squeezed his hand, he felt sure that there might be some truth to it. Had it really taken dying for him to finally find the family he had always longed for? "I hate to ask," the little ghost said, "but could you take me to my grave? I have to get there before daylight or the sun will burn me up."
I don't suppose it's close by, is it?
It was after midnight, and they'd be hard-pressed to make it to the car park by dawn. "It's Crestlawn Cemetery," he said, almost apologetically. Killian looked down at Madeline as he spoke.
That could take hours on foot, and we'll only just make it.
Madeline smiled at the little boy, reaching out for his hand before looking up at Killian.
It's okay. The car park will still be there next time.